Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Even if you want to talk about the use of condoms, I mean, it seems like men have to have a certain respect for their sexual partners before they're even going to use the condoms.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Roland Calvert, who is chaplain of the Adrian Dominican House in Adrian, Michigan. Father Bacik and Father Calvert will discuss AIDS, working towards prevention. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Roland, I'd like to speak with you a little bit about one of the great social questions of our time, and that is the problem with the illness that we call AIDS these days. We have some sense of the magnitude of this problem. I mean, it's just immense. The Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, which is a very good organization and does very reliable reporting, projects that by 1991, AIDS victims will number 270,000, with a total of almost 180,000 deaths by then. It gives us a little bit of sense of the magnitude of this problem. They estimate also that 2 million people carry what they call the HIV virus, the virus that causes AIDS. So we have a large problem indeed. In fact, it's international, as you well know.
Is the 2 million the current figure?
It might even be more than that. Yeah. I heard a biologist talking very recently about this, saying that the number may be 3 million, and that he said that the numbers stretch anywhere between 3 to even 5 million. Some people claim that's almost hard to imagine.
Well, actually, the World Health Organization last October put out official statistics, and they listed as worldwide right now 60,653 people with AIDS reported, but they say it's at least double, meaning currently at about 120,000, and they estimate actually carriers at up to 10 million. Their figures are even more frightening.
It is really an amazing thing. The biologist I was listening to recently was talking about the situation in Africa, of course, where you have very little reporting, and I think he made the statement, I better be careful here, but that there were some villages where you'd have almost 100% incidence of AIDS, of people infected with the AIDS virus.
Yes, I've heard that also.
It's a really insidious matter. And then also the great problems they're having, of course, in finding solutions to it. He was explaining to us how the virus works and so on, and how complicated it is to really find a way of preventing the disease.
Yes, yeah. It is all we have right now. There's no cure. The best estimates that I've heard are 5 to 10 years before there's any hope of a vaccine or something that would be effective. So right now there has to be education to get people not to contract the virus.
And that, of course, is a major focus of what we have to end up doing as a society. One other part of the problem seems to be that there is this long latent period with the virus, and that so that some people who have it simply don't know it, and the symptoms will show up only later on. I don't think with any of these things it's ever good to get into panic or scare tactics. But this man was advising again that people who give blood are tested automatically. That's one way for people to know. It's very simple while doing something good. It would be true, however, as he pointed out, that if someone very recently contracted the disease, that perhaps it wouldn't show up when they gave blood, because there's a tiny percentage that could happen in because of this latency period with the virus. That would be before the body would begin to build up the antibodies against the virus.
I think the incubation period is up to the last figure I heard 7 years possible, so that somebody conceivably could have contracted this in 82 and are just now catching the disease. And of course, many of the carriers, you have far more of those than who have the disease. I think about half do not contract AIDS. It's very mysterious why some people go on and get the full disease and others do not.
What this sets for us, of course, is very ethical problems, social policy questions that we have to end up dealing with. We have to talk about that whole business of prevention, since we don't have a cure at this point. And I guess one of the ways that is talked about these days is under the whole rubric of safe sex. And so there's a lot of talk about the use of condoms in sexual relationships. one of the things, I guess, generally known is that it is anal intercourse that very often is the cause of this, or the way that the virus is transmitted, put it that way. And so you have to begin to talk about a lot of those matters.
You have to get very specific, which is proving very difficult for many church leaders and individuals. For what you just said on radio, it will probably shock some people. But I think we have to begin facing the realities, and that the education can never be effective unless you speak honestly about what is happening and what needs to change.
I think that is certainly true, and I suppose part of the first thing we have to get around is a reluctance to talk about it.
Sure.
And it maybe one of the ways of doing that is to say that the stakes are high, that unless we do that, we are in big trouble. Most of the people I've heard lecture on, and it's good to remember that you and I speak about this, the medical thing, as lay people here. I mean, we're just reporting things we've heard from others and reports we've read and so on, and it would be another thing to have the biologist here or the medical experts. But again, it's like so many other public policy questions. Even as lay people in the field, we have to be able to talk about it, because if we leave it just to the experts, how are we ever going to filter down to the classroom, to young people, to the people who have to hear this kind of message?
Well, I think everybody, educators, priests, anybody who communicates or has contact with people, really has a deep responsibility to get educated. And if you remain ignorant in an epidemic that is this extensive, there is a moral failing, too. I mean, we may be lay people, and indeed we are, but we have to learn.
The other way, of course, that the virus is transmitted, as they talk about it, is through the needles, the intravenous drug users, through needles that become infected. It's a smaller percentage of people who receive it that way. Again, going back to some statistics that show that I think 17% of those people who have been diagnosed as having AIDS have gotten it from intravenous drug use. And there's 73% in the statistics I'm looking at that are homosexual or bisexual, and 1% that are heterosexual. Now, I don't know if you've seen other statistics on that or not.
No, those are pretty generally the ones. The statistics about gay and bisexual, they're men and not lesbians. I don't believe there are any cases among lesbians, which is an interesting phenomenon. And people who get out that old canard about this is God's punishment and lesbians wouldn't be affected, I think the argument's pretty weak. I'm not sure they understand why it has spread among certain parts of the population, or why certain people who get the virus go on and develop the disease. There's just a lot of mystery.
I've heard opinions about that among homosexual men who are practicing anal intercourse, that is likely to open up more ways in the body that the virus could be passed. There could be breakages in the skin and so on that would enable the virus to be passed that way.
Well, it is body fluids, semen or blood, that transmits it, and it has to be either intimate sexual contact, they say, or IV drug use, or a mother giving it to a baby. It is not transmitted casually. And I continue to hear people, including a pastor recently in a pretty responsible position, you repeat those things. You can get it by kissing. He brought up mosquitoes. There's just no evidence to back any of that. And I think along with the epidemic of sickness, there is also an epidemic of fear that you have to fight. That's part of the problem.
On our campus at the University of Toledo, they showed a film that had been done on PBS. I'm not really recalling the title of the film, but they, in very graphic ways, they tried to show that casual contact did not really transmit the disease. They were showing various ways of sharing glasses and eating the same food and all of those kinds of things.
That was narrated by Ron Reagan Jr.
That's right,
yeah. I saw it on PBS.
Yes.
Rather graphic, but I think what we need.
Yes, and I think the people that were watching it in our environment were not offended, although the professors who were introducing it were very careful to point out that there were parts of it that might be offensive to some people. But generally, it seems as though there's been a good reaction to that, a realization that those are the kind of things that have to be talked about. But that your point, I think, is well taken. We get back to my original point about avoiding panic in all of this and not running into scare tactics and so on. So And that's been involved, of course, in the school cases where the youngsters have been kept out of school. There's interesting contrast that one youngster who's been on television, and in the one school he was kept out and couldn't go and so on because he did have AIDS. He was a carrier of it, and then he went to another school, and he was just totally accepted. I mean, they were interviewing him saying, well, the kids were fine, and evidently in looking at it, the school people had prepared well for it. They had the school that accepted him. They had done background work and explained to the youngsters and so on, and everything seemed to be fine. So education there seemed to prove to be valuable, really.
Yeah. And I think you also combine it with a quality called compassion. And you have to care about people who are hurting, and certainly speaking as Christians, that seems to be one of the principal things we're called to. The American Catholic bishops put out their statement on AIDS, and one of the words that keeps showing up over and over is compassion. I was very interested in some of the controversy that followed that I think Cardinal Law in Boston says it overemphasizes compassion, and it doesn't mention conversion enough. I really wonder as Christians, whether we could ever overemphasize compassion. I know that you need other things too. You need education. You need to tell people to change their moral behavior if it's getting them into trouble. But compassion, it seems to me, is the essence of Christianity.
Indeed, and demonstrated by Jesus over and over, and to a very high degree. Compassion, of course, is such a rich word. I love the word in its root etymology. It means to suffer with, meaning that one would really empathize and be with and be present to another. And that surely would be important here. The document that you referred to is called The Many Faces of AIDS, a Gospel Response, and it was really issued by the Administrative Board of the Catholic Bishops. A large number of the bishops are on that board, and 60 members about, and they did issue that in the name of the other bishops. And I think that really is an excellent document, by the way. Our bishops have done such fine things over the years when we think of the peace pastoral and the economics pastoral, and I think that there's many good things in the document. I'm sure there'd be people who would disagree with certain parts of it, but there's large parts of it where there's no controversy at all, and they really do enter the public policy debate, and I think have important things to say about all of that.
It's a beautifully written document. I admire it simply because it's so readable, but also because of that great emphasis on compassion. You can make criticisms about it. They deal much, much more with the public sector. And what spiritual leaders should probably know a lot about, the inner spiritual journey of people with AIDS, that does not get a lot of attention. And I really suspect it may be the politics within the Conference of Bishops and the split of conservatives and moderates. I don't know what it all is, but they're much, much better with public issues than with private spirituality. And I don't think ever deal with the question of the anger, particularly of gay men, and how that relates to the bishops themselves and to church leaders and to the whole situation vis-a-vis the gay community. I don't find that handled as honestly as it could have been. But I sure don't want to put down the statement. I think it's a beautiful and compassionate statement.
Mm-hmm. And probably does have its strength, as you said, in the public arena, and that's where we're fighting the battle, of course, in this prevention of AIDS, and where we're trying to find public policies and ways of approaching all of this. I was at a discussion on the campus of this, and where they did show that film that I talked about that was narrated by Ronald Reagan Jr., and it was rather graphic. And the whole thrust of the conference really was under that heading of safe sex. And I suppose that where the major emphasis there is on the use of condoms, so that males who are involved in sexual activity would be careful not to transmit the disease by being careful in using a condom while engaged in that activity. They talk about things that most brands of condoms are safe, that there are certain types that are made that one has to be careful about, and that don't seem to contain the virus. So they get very explicit about all of this. In the film, they very graphic about how to use a condom and so on. And of course, right up front, we have to say that this is a bone of contention with many people. There's a question within the Catholic community that you and I are related to, that of whether that is a good thing to talk that directly about it. And I myself feel that the whole message of safe sex has to be put into a larger context, a religious context, and a larger ethical context. context. But for a moment, Roland, let's stay with this safe sex thing, and to make sure that we're understanding what their point about it.
Well, I think the very phrase it has really been revised, even in non-religious commentators. I hear more of them these days saying safer sex, because it is not safe sex in any absolute sense. Condoms may, for example, fail. There is a possibility in a small percentage of them that they will not protect against the virus being passed on, or pregnancy for that matter, or anything else. And so you can only relatively make a person safe. The best you can do is safer sex, so it's really important to notice the even technological dangers that are there. But as you say, to leave out the moral dimension is really to leave it in a vacuum that it's a bad place to leave the whole question, I think.
That's for sure. And I like your phrase. I really wasn't aware of that, and I think that maybe more accurately describes what they are after. One of the things that they made a point out of in the film we were talking about was the importance of wearing the condom even during the foreplay that would be involved in sexual relationship, because the virus could be transmitted in the fluid. Yes. And so I think that this is the kind of thing that you read in that literature.
Yes.
One of the things you don't read much about in all of that is the question of abstinence.
Yes.
In fact, in that film, there's sort of subtle and not so subtle put-downs of the question of abstinence, sort of like, well, we all know that isn't possible, and therefore let's start to think more realistically. Yeah. When I was in an audience with students listening to that, I knew some of those young people had very different ideas about sexuality. I knew some of them that take as their ideal that you should save intercourse for marriage, for example. Sure. And that those people need a voice in all of this. I don't think that people who are concerned about the moral dimension of this should just let the safer sex people have the whole arena, the public arena. The people who are trying to abstain need a voice. We have to be able to say, hey, that's actually the safest way of all of preventing this in terms of the sexual realm, to forget the drug use for a moment. Sure. But that's the safest way of all to manage this problem. In fact, if more and more people did practice this, we would be better off. Mm-hmm. And the people who are practicing it should not be made to feel as though they are somehow inferior or unenlightened or not mature or something. So that was one of my big points in all of this. Abstinence is an option. It's an option that I know that some very good people are trying to follow, and we should affirm that.
And you could use the word safe there, absolutely, because you would be absolutely safe. I do think it's important to relate to the world of reality. I was in high school teaching for most of my adult life, and the teenage pregnancies in Catholic high schools, according to the statistics that I have, are almost equal to pregnancies in public schools. And you do have to make the point that to preach abstinence and to say just say no, that very often it doesn't work. You really do need to perceive the world as it really is, I think, and try to deal with that. And some people will not be abstinent. And even in a moral discussion where we begin by saying that, which I think should be number one, and urge people to that, in our position also to recognize that it's not always going to be followed, at which point you come to the condoms and that controversial thing, what the Catholic teaching can do. Condoms are condemned in official Catholic teaching, and I don't think that we could preach them at any time. But not even to talk about them seems unrealistic. I mean, it's to take your position and to make it ludicrous. People will not listen to you if you don't at least admit that they're there and part of the real world.
I agree with you absolutely. I think we have to function as moral teachers within the real world and not the ideal world as we'd like to see it. Mm-hmm. And not everybody accepts Catholic outlook on sexuality, nor the general Judeo-Christian ethic, and we must deal with that world as well. Now, there have been some who have tried to argue that you can't do that is to cooperate in evil, and I would disagree with that, and I think there's good moral theologians who would say, no, that's not cooperation in evil, that is realistically trying to create a better situation. And of course our bishops have adopted that position in their own document by speaking about condoms themselves and recognizing that talk of that may have to be part of the whole educational effort that we make.
Wouldn't that be the very ancient and respected lesser than of two evils position?
That is the way the moralists have argued it. That's right.
Why would Cardinal O'Connor or anybody not accept that? I don't understand.
Well, I've seen a very detailed argument by Germain Griset, who trying to explain why that is not legitimate. That by the way the bishops phrased their statement, they identified themselves with the users. And in doing that, they are active cooperators in this evil of using condoms. But, Roland, to tell you the truth, I'm not sure that it's worth spending a lot of time on that argument. The bishops have made their position, and the real problem is how to get this education across in a moral framework. I'd like to move to the phrase like responsible sexuality instead of safer sex, the term that you use there. I would say that's the way we have to begin to talk. Even if you want to talk about the use of condoms, I mean, it seems like men have to have a certain respect for their sexual partners before they're even going to use the condoms. I mean, somebody could insist, well, you use it in this case, but if they get a person who didn't think about it or they're vacillating about it and they don't have any fundamental respect for their sexual partner, then there's a good chance sooner or later they are not going to use the condoms. So right there you've got an ethical dimension. And I don't care who you're talking to, we have to bring out respect for persons, that the carriers of AIDS need to have a responsibility not to infect others.
Absolutely. And especially considering how strong the sexual drive is. There's a real impetus, when two people are considering sex, and to just really let that blot out everything else and head toward that. And unless you have a very dominant thought, that I have to respect the life and the person of this other individual, you're going to forget condoms and everything else. I agree.
The movie that we were talking about is very explicit in this, in talking about how sexual partners should encourage the other one to use the condom. I mean, they sort of made it light of it, but they also pointed out that this is something you have to talk about, that people who are going to be involved in sexual relationships need to bring this up. I mean, you can no longer assume that your sexual partner doesn't have this disease. There was one person who was talking about all of this and saying that every time you have a sexual relationship with somebody that involves intercourse, you are having sex also with all their previous partners, because all their previous partners could have given them this disease, and you therefore are encountering all those other previous sexual partners. That's a pretty powerful statement, it seems.
Really is.
And tells us that we really do have to be careful about all of this.
I notice even in the communications, L.A. Law recently had an episode where two people were preparing for a sexual encounter, and she, just as a very casual piece of dialogue, says, the condoms are in the little table by the bed or whatever. And it's just very much more in the public consciousness now, which you may or may not like, but it's reality, and one has to deal with it, I think.
There's other cultures that have been more direct about it. In England, for example, where generally their TV is more open, and many things that occur on British TV would shock American audiences, given our great puritanical background, but they have been much more open in their advertising about the use of condoms. And we are, as you pointed out early on, we are dealing largely with an educational issue here. I mean, this massive social problem with no cure, we have to figure out ways to prevent it. And therefore, what we're trying to say is you have to keep a broader ethical viewpoint of this thing. If you do that, you remember that abstinence is important, and that we need a whole teaching on sexuality. These great problems are not solved by techniques. That's one of my major points. Techniques don't do it. The use of condoms is not going to solve some great social problem. It never works that way. You have to change attitudes. You've got to get better perspectives. That's what really counts in the great social issues. So here, one of the things we would want to do is to point out the great gift of sexuality, that sexuality stamps our whole being, God's gift to us, our way of reaching out and creating union and so on, and it's a beautiful thing and has to be used responsibly and in accord with God's plans and so on. I think all of that has to be part of our message.
Very much. And it's more than theory, because from statistics that I read, for example, in the gay community in San Francisco, which is one of the hardest hit of the places where AIDS is, the number of AIDS, it is not increasing anymore. Even venereal diseases, all of that is diminishing dramatically. So the education does work if it is used.
Yeah, I've seen those statistics, and they're quite remarkable. The incidence of AIDS is going down, and presumably it is because people in that community are recognizing the danger and are acting more responsibly in their sexual activity. You know, Roland, you could take this thing to the drug use as well. Although we said it was only 17% of the of those who are, as I said before, comes from drug use. But again, the problem isn't just clean needles. You know, the problem is that we got a giant drug culture, and we've got to talk about that problem from many angles. And we're not going to solve it just by clean needles. We have to talk about poverty questions and giving people a hope that they can get a job and so on. That's all part of solving this problem as well.
And sure, and people who feel that life have no meaning and will turn to drugs, or I think even in sex, this desperate search for intimacy and some kind of approval or whatever it is. If you don't get rid of that kind of emptiness, you're not going to solve the problem, and it is ethical and moral.
It is indeed, and you begin to get into all the justice issues when you bring up the drug question as well, of how we're going to get equal employment opportunities and so on.
Sure.
Roland, is there any other quick points you want to get in on prevention? You have just a few seconds.
Well, to be quite honest, there's no great point that comes to mind, except right now to repeat, it is the only thing we have. There is no cure, and if you do not prevent it, then you will have death.
Okay, Roland, we've been talking about the whole question of AIDS and prevention. We've brought up that document by the Catholic bishops, The Many Faces of AIDS, a Gospel Response. And one of the great values of that is that it does put the question in an ethical perspective. It does remind us there are moral considerations and that we need to find ways to get responsible sexual behavior going. And I've tried to emphasize the point that techniques won't solve the problem, that we have to have a broader perspective. We have a large social problem, and the point I think you have made so well is that we need education, and when education is done properly, we do indeed make progress. We've seen that. That ought to be a sign of hope in the whole midst of this AIDS epidemic.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Roland Calvert, who is chaplain of the Adrian Dominican Mother House in Adrian, Michigan. The topic of this week's Reflections was AIDS, Working Towards Prevention. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.